So Jan, Chip, it's so lovely to be here with you. And I thought a really nice place to start this conversation is to ask, in terms of relationships, what was your kind of what sparked your realizations about how this understanding can make a difference to people in relationship?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that because I think, we just had our 50th anniversary. Now, I mean, we must have been married when we were 6 and 7, right? But all joking aside, we probably wouldn't be sitting here together had we not encountered this understanding, the principles in Sid Banks. At the time of our first glimmer of this understanding, just before that, our relationship was pretty much in a mess and was coming to an end. If it had kept going in the direction it was going in, and I would say that we were both pretty unhealthy psychologically. We were pretty upset. And then Jan had an encounter with Sid Banks, which I wasn't present at, and we'd been searching together. We'd been looking for answers. We were trying to do something with our lives. But at this point, this juncture in our lives, we've been married about 6 or 7 years. Jan came home from an accidental encounter with Sid Banks, and something was changed, something was different.
So, as Chip said, we were both psychologically pretty unhealthy, and when we first met, our relationship was great. We fell in love, and we just knew we were meant to be together. We got married within less than a year when we met. We were just very certain, and we had a great start. And then we got really serious about searching for answers in life. And instead of seeing what we had right under our nose, we just started thinking there had to be more to life. And so we got very serious, and soon after that, I saw that Chip was becoming unhappy, and that's what his life had been like before we met. He'd had an unhappy childhood, and so I didn't know how to handle that. And so we both kind of went down together just into serious arguing. Personally, I started to feel really hopeless about life in general, especially about our marriage. And so when I met Sid through some friends, who happened to be going over his house, and I was with them, and so I met him. I walked into the room with all this baggage, like just worried about my marriage, and just always living in a really unhappy, hopeless state, and feeling very insecure. And when Sid was talking to a few people in the room, and I happened to be there, he started talking really powerful facts about life that I couldn't argue with. That's the way, when I look back, that was what hits me the most, is everything he said just made total sense and had the ring of truth to it. And so I basically, because I was a guest and I was trying to be polite, I just listened. And as each of these truths just descended on me, that just somehow got me just settled down into calmness. And that before I got there, my modus operandi was like a super busy mind, always analyzing and thinking too much. But as I heard Sid talk, and I got quieter, and then all of a sudden I heard him say, if everyone in this room could see who they really are on the inside, and how beautiful they are, they have all the happiness they could ever imagine. And that was my moment in time. I just, all of a sudden, all the baggage, the unhappiness, the hopelessness, the pessimism, it just all dropped away. And I just had this amazing calm feeling, and I had this certainty that my life was going to be beautiful.
You know what occurs to me, Jan, is to ask, how do you account for that? So like someone who's listening, I can imagine them going, hang on a second. So you had all this baggage, all this, habits and of thinking and bad feeling and all the stuff that had been weighing on you. And you're listening to this guy and he says this profound thing, and all of a sudden, not only does all the baggage drop away, but you just get this certainty that you're going to have a beautiful life. How do you account for that?
From what I have seen since what happened to me, how I account for it is that I really believe everyone has that home base inside themselves, that core, that's goodness and beauty, and I just not just heard Sid say that and believed it. I just knew it in that moment, and so watching this play out in my life and seeing how everybody has it. I've seen that in my family. I've seen it in people around me. I've seen it in my work, that I'm becoming more and more convinced that everyone has that same thing inside them. And what just occurred to me is that even though in that moment the baggage dropped away, then when I went back to my regular life and I went home and I was back in my same house, same marriage and everything, something inside me was just in touch with this wisdom of how to reconcile all the things in my life that were uncomfortable or not working. And so it's not as if I went back to my life and it was, the baggage was gone so much that I was like sitting up on a cloud, in the lotus position and just experiencing sheer joy. I actually had to live my life again, but in a way that I was seeing what the negative part of my life for what it was, which is not the truth. So I was living from an inside truth that shone the light on the outside and helped resolve all those things that had been plaguing me.
I love what you just said, Jan, that when you went kind of back into your regular life, there was this core within you that even if you still had some of the negatives, and I assume that both within your own experience and stuff that you're experiencing from others, you could see that it was not the truth. And for someone who's listening and says, okay, what's the difference between what you know to be true and what's not the truth, that, the baggage and that sort of thing. What's that distinction for you?
When I'm in the feeling of my true self, which I felt that's what I connected with that day many years ago. It was in 1975, so it was a long time ago. There's a feeling that comes with that. And so when I went back home and started to live my life from that wisdom, I was guided by that feeling. First of all, I got the feeling back that I'd lost. Like I was so unhappy until I heard that from Sid that day. I had been so miserable that I'd become tolerant of it in a way. Even though I was unhappy and sad, I was able to get through my day with those feelings. And when I got home that day and I witnessed my life, I saw that when I was in a beautiful feeling, things were kind of changed around me. They were more in harmony. And when I got upset about something, I saw that was just working against me. So really, the feeling is what I can think of as the most incredible guide, and to help you actually find what you're looking for in life. And also it is the goal. That feeling is the goal.
Yeah, I remember when we were on our most recent Tenerife retreat, and Chip said, the experience you're living in is all you get. And it really struck me. You've kind of alluded to that, like the ultimately that's what we experience day to day is whatever we're living in. And Chip, you said that when Jan came back from uh, that first encounter with Sid, the way you put it was she'd been changed. Uh, is that something that was evident to you when she walked through the door, or was it?
Oh yeah, it was evident, but I have to say that I didn't think it was real at the time. You know, I thought, what is this? You know, like here we were in all this tumult and upset all the time. Our marriage falling apart, and Jan comes home, and basically in her mind everything's okay now, right? And I'm like, really? And she, there's no doubt that she looked different and was carrying herself differently, but I dismissed it because I couldn't understand how it was possible to be caught up in all that thought that we were in. I didn't think about it this way, but to have so much upset and so many things that we were angry with each other for and so on. And all of a sudden, Jan's not angry or not upset anymore. In fact, she's feeling really good according to her. And I dismissed it, to be honest. I dismissed it because it wasn't within the realm of possibilities for me at that time. It was like, really? And when she tried to explain a little bit about the understanding that really all that was going on between us was a bunch of piled up thought, that just struck me as totally absurd. You know, like, really? And so I hung out in that space for a while. And as a matter of fact, people have heard us tell the story before. I was desperate to get Jan back where I knew her, you know, to get an argument going again and be upset because I knew where the handles were in that kind of relationship. That's what I was used to. And I remember in those early days when Jan first came home from that I would try to get her upset, and it would work for a little bit, but I'd always see that moment when I could just see she's not going there, you know, and I'm on my own. And that was very disturbing to me. As a matter of fact, I remember that period as being very lonely because at least before we were in it together. And so what's really fascinating as you ask these questions is looking back. I'll come to how that started to change for me, but looking back, we had this change. Like I eventually saw something, and looking back, I can't see one specific thing or habit or argument or anything that we consciously changed. See, this is what's really interesting about it. During the last talk that I did, it occurred to me to talk about how when you have an insight, which is what happened with Jan, she had a really deep insight when she met Sid. When you have an insight, you don't have to go through all of your head and correct this habit and that thought. And you know, it's like it wipes, in a sense, momentarily wipes the slate clean, and your thoughts are automatically reordered. You know, you automatically see the innocence of everybody around you. You automatically see that everybody's is operating at the end of their thinking. And so for me, I hung out in this state for a while after Jan met Sid for 2 or 3 weeks. And I ended up talking to this woman who I thought was the cause of all of our problems, because she was the one that I thought Jan was talking to about Sid Banks. And I was having a conversation with her, and somewhere along the line, she asked me what was on my mind. And I just really got belligerent and told her how stupid all this was, and she needed to butt out of our marriage and so on and so forth. And she was like kind of shocked, right? And I was in it. I was really upset. And then out of nowhere, she looked at me and she said, you know, Chip, the only thing that stands between you and Jan and all the love and happiness in this world is thought. And my mind just went, oh, give me a break. But at that moment, I happened to be looking over her shoulder at Jan, and I was struck with this really, whoosh, just this deep feeling. I got this emotional feeling. And I didn't want to experience that at the moment with that person. So actually I stood up and said it was a bunch of bleep bleep and walked out. But I knew I'd seen something, because in a flash, when she said that, I somehow pictured all of our fights and arguments as these little piles in my head. And I remember actually thinking, well, of course they're just thought. What else could they be, you know? But then I dismissed it. And I hung out in that negative state for another week or two, as I recall. And then one day, Jan was sitting on the floor playing with our son. I was sitting on the couch, and a very low light was coming in through the window and shining on them. And I was just looking at them. And out of nowhere, that feeling just rushed in. And I don't know how to explain this, but I've never really explained it, I guess. In spite of the fact that I've been in such a low state, I recognized that feeling. I knew it was right, this feeling that had rushed in while I looked at Jan and Peter. And it just rushed in and it grabbed me. And I remember just becoming very clear and thinking, all I have to do is surrender and just give it up, which is essentially what happened. And our marriage, our relationship forward to this day has never been the same. And so what we're describing, Jan's experience and mine, are those first moments when you step out of your thinking for whatever reason. You just step out of your thinking and you see what's in front of you. You know, you see what's in front of you. And once that happened, again, we almost instantly, our marriage was so much better, and the fighting stopped, and we just became happy together. But looking back, I honestly can't see one specific thing that we set out to change.
I love it. And what you're pointing to is the incredible power, whether we call it insight or a moment of truth, or the power that has to transform lives, transform relationships. And I can imagine for someone listening to this going, hang on a second. So there's not some set of practices that you adopted, or you didn't kind of make some new agreements, or you didn't like hash out your issues with each other. You just like saw something new and then your relationship changed. Like, tell me more about that. I can really imagine that. And so I was wondering, Jan, I know what you said was you just had that certainty that you were going to have a beautiful life and a happy relationship and all of this. How have you seen that certainty and this power of insight playing out in the relationships of people you've worked with? Because I know you guys have worked with everyone from CEOs of companies to people in halfway houses. You've worked with people on relationships and people on changing relationships at work and changing relationships in their personal lives. What are some of the ways that you've seen this play out for others?
Well, it always goes down to everybody taking care of their own state of mind and their own happiness. And that's what happened to me that day. I had been so wrapped up in worrying about Chip and how unhappy he was becoming, and that I forgot just to take care of myself, and that's all I really needed to do, you know. And so when I found that feeling of happiness in myself, I heard something about just look after yourself, you know, and honor yourself in a way, then I started just to live that way. And so the work came from us living it. We didn't have this kind of work before. We became happy, and some people, you know, that we knew, or just by virtue of how we were learning together at the beginning with a few other folks, but it just started to blossom. And I don't know how to, it was kind of a magical thing. We started talking to people in a setting where people were coming to hear about the principles and basically just sharing our story. And that grew into doing that with like more in more settings. And then that turned into Chip starting to work in business. And so we, because of our change, it drew us into these situations where people who were looking for answers came into our world. And so it's kind of an organic process.
That really makes sense to me. And something you said, Jan, is that as you started to kind of take care of your own happiness, your own state of mind, your own well-being, that really not only nourished your relationship, but also created the kind of conditions for people to seek you out and for you to share what you were seeing and that sort of thing. Now, I know a lot of people in the, in the whole domain of personal development and, spirituality and that sort of thing. They say this thing of put your own oxygen mask on first. And it's like, yeah. And so that's kind of a well-known piece of advice. But what I hear you saying and you both pointing to is something much deeper than that. And it's something that's, it's almost a realization that I'm going to put words in your mouth now, so feel free to change them after I've said them. But the thing that we can bring to a relationship is our own happiness, our own well-being, our own clarity, our own knowledge about who we are, who we all are, and what we have going for us. Like that's what we can bring, give, offer to a relationship. But that's what's hitting me right now. I feel free to say that differently or say, no, that ain't it, Jamie. But I'd love to hear you guys speaking to that and how you've seen that changing people's relationships in your work.
Yeah, I think that was really well put, Jamie. Mm-hmm. I think that was perfect description, because if we go back to our first experience, what really brought me to the point where I saw something was eventually realizing that Jan's change was permanent and real, even though I disbelieved it at first, right? But after a while, it became obvious that something had happened, right? Mm-hmm. So you could look at it this way, that Jan taking care of herself in her own state of mind gave me the opportunity to see that possibility. But the other thing it did is it gave her a suit of armor in terms of dealing with my negativity, because she had found a way to not take it personally for the most part, to not take it, to just see it as my thinking giving the state of mind that I was living in, and just not take it personally, which left me in the position of doing my thing and nobody responding, And what that did for me is it brought me to the moment of curiosity, like, what is this, right? Like, what is this? And that's the turning point in our health. We think the world is constructed a certain way, and we live by what we think is going on and what we think is real, and we live through our habits. And when we encounter health and we see that it's real, it brings us, if we're lucky, it brings us to that moment of curiosity. And the moment of curiosity is the moment that you start moving towards health, because you start to listen and you start to look at what's possible. Now, if you look at the history of this whole understanding, the same thing has happened over and over again. When Sid Banks had his experience, everybody around him, of course, thought he'd lost his mind, and he was just a simple working guy, a welder, and all of a sudden he's talking about understanding the spiritual nature of life and changing the world of psychology and so forth. And so people were frightened who were around Sid in the beginning. But his new state of mind, his calmness, his kindness, his gentleness, his patience with people, finally allowed people to see that something real had occurred. And so that fear turned into curiosity, and then the curiosity turned into listening. And the thing about listening with this understanding is, as soon as you really listen to what's possible and you entertain the thought that there's something within us that is healthy, then there's an element that enters your thinking, and that element is hope. And sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say the second hope enters our consciousness rather than all the pessimism that we've lived in because of the conditions of our life. It changes the direction of our thinking.
Mm.
And we're on our way once that happens. And so just to finish my point about it's always happened this way. When we worked in business, there was always that one person, senior person, not always the CEO, but sometimes, who had their own insight and became so much more secure and solid that everybody could see something was different, right? When we worked in the prisons, it was that 2 or 3 inmates that we worked with to begin with, who had these really powerful insights, and their behavior and their way of being in that horrible environment changed so much that everybody was shocked. Everybody was confused. But that confusion led to that healthy curiosity, right? It was the same for me. I mean, my first experience with Jan was confusion. I couldn't understand what this was or how this could be, right? But confusion leads to that curiosity, and then curiosity leads to listening and help. And that's been the same in every projects we've ever worked with, every couple we've ever worked with. There's that moment where one person has a real insight about their true nature, and their way of responding to their partner or to their world or to the business they're operating in shifts. And everybody gets confused around that in the beginning, which is wonderful.
Mm. Yeah, I love it. And the thing that struck me as I listened to you, because I've had my own experience of having an insight and suddenly having hope where there was none before. And I wouldn't have even called it that at the time, but that's exactly what it was. And the thing that struck me is that hope and humility go hand in hand, because the moment before hope kind of shone a light on the situation or illuminated things, I was sure that how I saw it was right and was the way things were and things couldn't change and that sort of thing. And part of the hope was like, oh, maybe I'm not as right as I thought I was about this. Maybe that's the best news I've had all day. So what are some of the ways that as that one person in the relationship or in the organization or whatever the context might be, as they've woken up to this and the first people have become confused and then they've started to see that there's something there, what are some of the changes that you've seen take place, whether it's in couples or whether it's in teams or whether it's in families? What have you seen that kind of speaks to the impact of this understanding?
And what comes to mind right away is people see someone who they couldn't love before with love. And what I've had so many people say to me is that they saw the person as new, whether it was their spouse or a parent that they couldn't get along with, a mother or father or someone, that when they got this understanding for themselves, they were maybe not right away, but I've seen it happen so many times that people have formed a new relationship with someone in their life that they've been alienated from. And it happened, we were at a conference recently where so many people came up to us after we talked and said that since we saw them last, how they're now getting along so well with their mother or their father or their spouse. Or I mean, that was the most I heard from people who came up to us to say hello. And what really strikes me is that just to kind of bring it down to earth and put out something that I think people could really grab onto from what we're talking about is, it just occurred to me that I used to be so reactive to people's behavior because I really used to think because I thought I had myself figured out and I was always analyzing myself, then I would be trying to analyze other people and figure out why they said this or why they said that or why they acted this way. when I got this understanding, excuse me, the more I continue to get this understanding, the more I see the innocence in everyone. That even though I don't feel it all the time, I know that everyone has that same true self and that same innocence in their true self. Now, their personal self, all of us have a personal self that has sometimes positive behavior, sometimes negative behavior. And in my life now, I don't buy into other people's behavior as much as I used to. It still affects me sometimes, but I can see past the behavior to what's really in that person, that beauty and that innocence. And so what I observe is the more I see it in other people, the less they demonstrate that negative behavior when they're around me.
Yeah, I love that. And just in case it's a question on people's minds, what I'm not hearing you say is that you put up with bad behavior or behavior that is damaging to you or anything like that. A lot of times when people hear that you can see the innocence in someone's behavior, they're kind of like, but if I didn't see that that's bad, then I wouldn't protect myself, or I wouldn't, I'd let him get away with murder, or that sort of thing. How do you guys see that from a, that it's not even a balance, but the ability to see the innocence in another person while still being, taking care of the things that it's appropriate to take care of?
It's a really great question, and I know people think about that. And just to be very clear, you can see the innocence and still protect yourself from whatever behavior is coming from that lostness. The reason you want to see the innocence is twofold. One is it's a fact that people are lost in their thinking and behaving out of that thinking, right? But secondly, when you look at it that way, you get to not take it personally. You get to not take the behavior personally. And as a matter of fact, my experience is when you're not taking it personally, you defend yourself from it much more appropriately. You don't overdo it. You don't get caught up in it. You don't get caught up in the anger and everything. And so you have this kind of clarity, speaking of clarity, that allows you to take care of yourself and deal with it. It's like, I often tell the story of my father's change. My father was a pretty messed up guy through most of his life. And he changed. Now, I certainly came to a point where I saw his innocence, but there's no way I would have put up with his former behavior, right? But I don't want to carry that. I don't want to become upset and sick within myself and defending myself against that behavior. If I see it as innocence and lostness, if I look at it that way, then I just deal with it in a very matter-of-fact, straightforward way, and I don't rent him a room in my head. And that's the big difference. Like the other part of that is when you don't get caught up when somebody's, let's just say it's not really crazy behavior, but somebody's negative talk or negative put downs with you, whatever it is, when you don't get caught up, the other person feels that because they're used to the habit of you responding in a certain way. And again, that's another way that beautiful confusion gets created. Like, that's part of what confused me in the beginning is after a while, I couldn't get Jan to react the old way because she was seeing my innocence and just not taking it personally. She just saw me living at the end of my thinking and realized that that's not who I was. Now, as I recall, she didn't put up with anything. Like sometimes she'd walk away, or sometimes she'd say, I'm not going to talk about that anymore, whatever it was. But it was from this calm place of, I'm putting words in Jan's mouth, but it was in this calm place of, I don't live there anymore, And that's really powerful, in terms of not just what you experience, but what the person who is giving you a hard time experiences. Because we really are used to, I say this, you do that. You say this, I do that. I mean, we get locked in these dances with people that we have relationships with. And so I think that's an incredible dynamic, that once you have the ability to step back and not take it personally, your life is instantly better with that understanding. And there's a chance that the other person will see something in that. Now, I'll tell you the most dramatic place we ever saw that is we ended up doing a project talking to people in a women's shelter. When we started talking, we knew that we wanted to talk about psychological innocence because we wanted these people to have the freedom of stepping out of those relationships and just finding some peace within themselves. But I mean, that's a delicate thing to approach. These are people who have been physically injured, you know. But we found our way by telling our own story and eventually talking about your freedom from this will eventually come as you begin to understand the innocence of who's giving you that terrible life. What was interesting is they eventually started to talk amongst themselves and began to see that their true self, their freedom within them, had nothing to do with that other person or what they'd been through. And what we found was amazing is they started responding very differently. You know, the old stuff about they're in that relationship and they keep going back to it, or in some cases they've had 2 or 3 relationships like that, very negative. This group of women just began to take care of their lives and just to rearrange their lives totally. And we're excited about the adventure of rearranging their lives, right? And in my estimation, it really found freedom from what had been put upon them, you know. And so it is a tricky thing to look at until you begin to see that you're not putting up with the behavior, but you're not taking it in and hurting yourself with all the anger and upset and all the stuff that goes with it. You get to be free, truly free from that negativity. And so once you're free of that negativity, you start to have that hope in your thinking. You begin to see differently. You begin to act differently. You know?
That really is powerful. And it raises a question, which is, if for instance, women's shelter is sort of the extreme example of something, I can imagine a number of people listening to this and they'll maybe being like, well, I'm not battered, but I'm not sure that the relationship I'm in is right for me, or maybe they've got one foot out the door, or they're and in our society, there's all kinds of advice about that. So for instance, women are told by many people that they just have to get out, but actually, I know you guys aren't offering advice. You're pointing people to the truth of who they are, and that confidence that they will find the way that's right for them, and the decisions that are right for them, and the way of navigating that situation that's right for them. What would you say to someone who's not sure about the relationship they're in, or maybe they're 1 foot in or 1 foot out, or they're thinking about it a lot, or they've been making lists of good and bad. What's your take on that?
My advice to people is always the same advice of just take that time to get to know yourself and find what makes you happy. And even in the midst of, living with someone where you're not happy when you're together, make the most of the time when you're on your own. Like everyone somehow has some little bit of time when that time is theirs, if they can either create it or somehow make use of it, and just find more contentment in your life and in the things that you love, and just be and trust in that. And because I've watched people do that. Like I had someone that was really struggling with work and relationships, and whenever I talked to them, they would just as we were making small talk at the beginning of our session, this person loved to walk their dog in this park. And this would come up every week when we talk, and so or every 2 weeks, whenever it was. And so it just hit me that every time they got that look on their face, like the really trying to figure life out, and well, but there's this challenge and that challenge, and I it just hit me one day. So, well, why don't you take your dog for a walk in the park more? You know, you seem to get a really nice feeling from that. And they were just like confused, right? And then the next time we spoke, there was a different person that I was talking to.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about the dog and it wasn't about the park, but it was just like they gave themselves some space to get into a beautiful feeling, to get a nice feeling. And so that if our true self is, that's all it is just beautiful feeling without any of the negativity. It's the raw version of ourself before life came along and we started thinking and, you know, being conditioned. And so back into that raw form of our true essence, which is, I believe, is pure joy. If we start tapping into that, that's where the learning happens. We learn from that feeling, that beautiful feeling. And that is really challenging, as it was for Chip when I came home that day. That's challenging for people to accept as possible, and that could be the answer in life. But for me, that's what's happened. I've grown more and more to be content with my own personal experience of life, and to watch that grow. And as it grows, I see my world changing around me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you, Jan. And that's all we've got time for today. But I know you guys work with people both via Skype, and sometimes people come and see you in person, and you work with individuals and couples and with businesses. What's the best way for people to find out more about what you do and get in touch with you?
I think the best way is probably just if you Google us, and you'll see some of our YouTube. We have a YouTube channel, and you'll see some of our recordings, and then our website, vantageconsult.com.
So that's vantageconsult.com.
Yes.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been really, really wonderful.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks,
it's always
Jamie.
wonderful to talk with you. And
Absolutely.
thanks for all the nice things you're doing to make the world a nicer place.
For sure.
Oh, same to you guys. Thank you.